All right, so welcome to part two of the sort of Excel tutorial for Chem 3 for your first lab report. So in the second part of your lab, you collected a bunch of data, I think 8 or so trials of increasing volumes and masses. So for my 8 trials, I used a 10 milliliter volumetric pipette, so 10, 20, 30, 40, all the way up to 80. And then for the masses, I had 10.126, and this is the mass of just the soda, not including the beakers. So 10.126, 20.212, 30.135. Oh, yeah, so I just actually screwed that up. So if you ever typo things, you can either type in the cell again from scratch, or if you can click, and then up here in this formula bar, you can come in and change it to 135. Or another way is double click in here, and then now I have a little line to come in and edit things. But anyway, let me get the rest of this data entered in really quick. So what we're going to do with this is create a linear plot of increasing mass and volume to the point where we're going to add a trend line to it and do a bit of linear regression. So here I have my mass and my volume. I'm going to double click here to shift the column over so that's not impeding. And I said these were done with a volumetric pipette, so that should be 10.00 milliliters. In Excel, any zeros after the decimal point by default don't show up. So like this data point here was 80.210 from my mass on my scale. So if I want to get it to display that, I can highlight the cells and shift the decimals. So up here on my toolbar, I can shift the decimals left. That's far too many, so I'm going to shift it back a couple. So cool, now I'm displaying the appropriate number of decimals and significant figures for a volumetric pipette. I can do the same thing here to get that 0 to show up on that last one. You don't really have to do that unless you're printing out the table to attach to your report or something. You'd want to display the appropriate number of significant figures. So anyway, onto the linear regression. I'm going to highlight these data points, go to insert like I did in the previous video, hover over my scatter plot, and just collect the first one. I don't want to connect the dots. I want to actually be able to see these data points because we're going to add a trend line to it, a linear fit. So I'm just going to do sort of unmarked individual dots. And I actually screwed this up. This is backwards right now. As I said in the previous video, the leftmost column when you do a graph is X values and the rightmost column is Y. We're creating this plot so that the slope of the line will give us the density of whatever substance, so whatever Coke, Sprite, whatever it was. I currently have mass in the left, so the purple box here is telling me that these values are my X's and the blue are my Y. So another way to troubleshoot this is hover over a data point and it'll say so I'm currently hovering over this data point. I have 40.132 as my X and 40 as my Y. I know that's wrong, so I'm going to delete this graph really quick and reposition my columns by cutting and pasting this over. Okay, now come back, insert scatter plot, boom. Now if I hover one of these data points, my volume should be my X. It's also displaying in purple over here. But to double check, the data points now reads 40.132. Right, so now I'm good. I have mass on my Y values or on my Y axis and volumes on my X. So mass over volume, my rise over my run will give me a slope, and that slope will tell me what my density of my soda is. So let's add some chart things. So again, when you select the chart, your interface toolbar up top will change to something like this. I have add chart elements, so I'm going to add some labels. Boop, boop. Add a title to this thing. Right, so this axis, my X is volume, and include units, which I'm denoting are milliliters. This is mass in grams. All right. And then the last thing as before is add a trend line. Or sorry, we didn't do this last time. So now I'm adding a trend line to this. I have a bunch of things. What I'm actually going to want is more trend line options. Excel default usually suggests linear. It depends on what your data looks like. This data looks extremely linear, so it's going to suggest a linear trend line. But what I wanted, the reason I checked more trend line options is I want the equation of this line and the R-squared value, which is sort of a statistical representation of how well the data fits, or how well the trend line fits the data. So the last thing here is to add a chart title. Like I said in the previous video, we don't ever want our titles to just be a repetition of the axes titles. So what is this graph about? Well, we're going to use it to figure out the density of our soda. So I might just call this thing like, not density of, I used Coke. So sure, something like that. Some title that makes sense to you that also conveys more information than what the axis title already conveys. So yeah, here I have a pretty good looking graph. There's not a lot of dead space in it. All of the data's in here, kind of neat. The trend line shows up. The mass and volume have labels. So the last thing that we'll have to do with this is some linear regression using the data analysis tool pack. So if you haven't yet, in that Excel document, there are instructions on how to enable the data analysis tool pack. If you've done it right, up top on your toolbar, if you go to data, somewhere over here in the top rightish corner, there's going to be a logo or a little symbol that looks like this, and it may or may not say data analysis next to it, but when you hover over it, it should indicate to you, as mine is, like, hey, data analysis tools, right? So if I click that, it's going to pull up a window of a bunch of various things. What you're going to look for is regression, and then hit OK. They are listed alphabetically for just an FYI. All right, so now it's going to prompt me for some things. So it's going to prompt me for my Y values first, which it feels a little bit backwards, but I know my Y values are my masses, so I'm going to, once selected in here, click and drag through those cells. Input my X range, click and drag through those as well. There's a ton of other stuff in here that you can use. We're not going to use it for this class. If you take upper level chemistry courses, you will most likely use them. But we'll click OK. And what this is going to do is it's going to propagate a new spreadsheet entirely, right? So it will now create sheet 2. This is a whole clustered mess once it imports it in. I showed you earlier that double clicking between 2 columns will automatically adjust the size. So if I double click while I've got all of these columns selected, it'll automatically shift it for all of them, which is kind of cool. So boop. I didn't do it. Hold on. My bad. Click and select them all. Double click again. Cool. That time it worked. I probably misclicked slightly in there. So there's a ton of numbers in here. What you need for your lab are the slope and the intercept and the error in each of them. So here is the intercept, which I'm going to, sorry, misclicked. I'm going to highlight the 4 boxes of most importance. You'll notice the R-square value is also up here. This is useful because in the previous graph, it sort of rounds to a, well, in this case, an R-squared value of 1. But I have a slope of like 1.007, which is right here, 1.007, 214, et cetera. And then here is the uncertainty or the error in that slope. So your slope is 1.007 plus or minus 0.0005. And then the 2 values above it are the y, or sorry, the y-intercept to 0.1317, which is displayed right here as well. And then the number to the right of that is the error in the intercept, which is about 0.028, right? So yeah, that is it for the Excel sort of tutorials. If you have other questions about how to do things in Excel, ask us as instructors, reach out, find other YouTube videos, other resources to help you. My general #1 tip in Excel is if you want to edit something, sort of pick what you want to edit. So in this case, this axis, and right click, and it will give you a drop-down menu of options. And somewhere in that menu is usually a way to edit what you want. So, but yeah, thanks for watching, and let us know if you have any other questions.